The digital clock on the coffee maker read 6:42 a.m. when I saw her. The sun was still a hesitant promise behind the silhouette of the Cascade Mountains, that pale, watery blue that only happens in the Pacific Northwest just before dawn. I was standing at my kitchen sink, rinsing my favorite mug, a heavy ceramic thing my late wife, Helen, had bought me years ago. It said, "Chief Problem Solver" on the side, a little joke from her about my career. Through the window over the sink, which looked out over my back garden and the fence line, I saw the movement. It was Carol Hartman, president of the Northwood Creek Homeowners Association, and she was on my property. She was not admiring the early blooming crocuses. In her hands, she held a pair of bolt cutters. They were bright yellow, the kind you buy at a big box hardware store, and they looked absurdly large in her grasp. She was a small woman, but she radiated an energy that filled the space around her, a compressed storm of grievances and self-importance. She was wearing a pink velour tracksuit, a completely inappropriate choice for wet grass and manual labor, and she was attacking the chain and padlock I had used to secure the small gate in my back fence. I didn't move. I just watched, the water running over my hands, the ceramic mug cool against my fingers. I watched as she struggled, her small frame lacking the leverage to bring the jaws of the cutters to bear. She grunted, a sharp, frustrated sound that was faintly audible even through the double-paned glass. The chain was thick, galvanized steel. The padlock was a Master Lock commercial model, a Brinks C-Series clone, more than capable of resisting a casual assault. I knew its specifications because I had chosen it specifically for this eventuality. I had bought it 6 months ago. I kept the receipt. My coffee was already brewed. I turned off the tap, dried my hands on a dish towel, and poured myself a cup. Black, no sugar. I took a slow sip, letting the heat bloom in my chest, the familiar bitterness a small, grounding comfort. Then, carrying the mug, I walked to the back door, unlocked the deadbolt, and stepped out onto my patio. The air was cool and damp, smelling of wet earth and pine needles from my neighbor's Douglas fir. Carol didn't notice me at first. She was completely absorbed in her fight with the lock, her face contorted in a mask of furious effort. The metal screeched in protest as she twisted and pulled. "Good morning, Carol," I said. My voice was calm, conversational. She jumped, letting out a small shriek, and dropped the bolt cutters. They landed with a heavy clatter on the flagstones of the path inside my property line. She spun around, her face a mixture of shock and anger. Her cheeks flushed a blotchy red that clashed horribly with the pink of her tracksuit. "Robert!" she hissed, her voice tight with adrenaline. "You startled me." "I can see that," I said, taking another sip of coffee. "That's a formidable-looking tool you have there. Having some trouble?" Her composure snapped back into place with an almost audible click. The shock evaporated, replaced by the familiar, imperious glare she reserved for residents she deemed non-compliant. She was the performative tyrant, and the patio was her stage. "Don't play dumb with me, Robert," she snapped, pointing a trembling finger at the gate. "You know perfectly well why I'm here. This is an illegal obstruction. I have had multiple complaints from residents about your decision to block the community access path." I looked at the gate. I looked at the fence it was part of. I looked at the small, manicured lawn on my side of the fence and the slightly wilder common area on the other. "This isn't a community access path, Carol," I said, my tone still even. "This is my property. The gate is on my property. The fence is on my property." "It has been used as a cut-through to the park for 20 years, she declared, puffing up her chest. 20 years. That establishes a right-of-way. It's historic use. You can't just unilaterally decide to lock it. This is a community, Robert, not your personal fiefdom." I stayed silent. I let her talk. I've found over a 30-year career in law enforcement that if you just stay quiet, people will tell you everything you need to know. They will confess to crimes they haven't committed. And more importantly, they will lay bare the entire flawed foundation of their own argument. I am the president of the Northwood Creek HOA, she continued, as if I were unaware. And I am officially instructing you to remove this lock and cease obstructing this pathway. If you refuse, I will have the lock cut myself, which I was trying to do, and you will be billed for the service. Furthermore, you will be issued a fine of $100 per day, retroactive to the day you installed this illegal lock, until the obstruction is cleared. I will see to it that a lien is placed on your house if you do not pay. Do you understand me? She finished, breathless, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of her own authority. I took a long, slow sip of my coffee. The mug felt solid and reassuring in my hand. I looked at her, at the ridiculous bolt cutters on my path, at the locked gate, and at the self-satisfied, triumphant expression on her face. I thought about the meticulously organized file in my office, the hours of research, the certified letters, the property surveys, the digital recordings. I thought about the conversation I'd had with my old partner, now the chief of police for this entire county. She had no idea. She had absolutely no idea who she was talking to, what she had stepped into, or how thoroughly she had just sealed her own fate. She thought this was a battle of wills, a neighborhood squabble. She didn't understand that for me, this was just paperwork. It was a case, and I had already finished it. All that was left was the presentation. "Carol," I said, my voice dropping just a fraction, losing its conversational warmth, and taking on a different kind of quiet. A professional quiet. "You have just committed several crimes. Specifically, criminal trespass, attempted criminal mischief in the second degree, and you have made a threat which constitutes coercion, as defined by state statute. I would advise you to pick up your tool, leave my property immediately, and consult with an attorney." Her face went blank. It was a look I'd seen 1,000 times in interrogation rooms. The moment when a suspect's carefully constructed reality collides with an undeniable and unpleasant fact. The mask of the performative tyrant slipped, and for a second I saw the confused, insecure person beneath. Then the anger returned, hotter than before. "How dare you? I am the authority here. I'm calling the police," she sputtered, fumbling in her tracksuit pocket for her phone. I raised my coffee mug in a small, non-threatening gesture. "Please do," I said. "I would very much like for you to do that." I turned, walked back inside, and locked the door, leaving her on my patio, stabbing at her phone with a trembling finger. I went back to my desk and got to work. She had no idea she just buried the only thing keeping her street dry. But before I tell you what I did next, I should probably explain how we got here. It didn't start with a fence. It never does. It starts smaller. It starts with a misplaced sense of entitlement, a lack of curiosity about facts, and a community that is too tired, too busy, or too intimidated to push back. I moved to Northwood Creek 10 years ago, 2 years after Helen passed. We'd lived in the city, in a dense, noisy neighborhood close to the precinct. After she was gone, the house felt too big, and the city felt too loud. The silence was an entity in itself, and the sirens and traffic no longer felt like the soundtrack to a vibrant life, but an intrusion on a quiet grief. I was the captain of the Major Crimes Division then, a job that consumes you whole if you let it. Helen had been my anchor, the one who pulled me back to shore every night. Without her I was drifting, so I put in my papers, retired a few years earlier than planned, and bought this house. It was smaller, with a garden, backing onto a stretch of protected greenbelt that led to a park. It was quiet. That was all I wanted. Peace and quiet. My profession for over 30 years was the methodical application of rules to chaos. A crime is a tear in the social fabric, a disruption of order. My job was to take the messy, emotional, violent chaos of a crime scene and translate it into a series of documented, verifiable facts. Reports, interviews, evidence logs, timelines, chain of custody forms. You build a case brick by brick, document by document, until the structure is so solid and the conclusion so inevitable that a jury of 12 ordinary people can see the truth as clearly as you do. You don't win cases with emotion, or shouting, or performance. You win them with preparation. You win them on paper. I was very, very good at my job, but I had no desire to apply those skills to my personal life. I wanted to prune roses, read history books, and drink coffee on my patio. I wanted to be left alone. Carol Hartman was elected president of the HOA board 3 years after I moved in. She had lived in the neighborhood for decades, a lifer who saw the influx of new families and retirees like me as a threat to her established order. Her campaign was based on a platform of restoring property values and enforcing the covenants, which was really just code for harassing anyone whose lawn was a shade too long or whose garbage cans were visible from the street for 5 minutes longer than the bylaws allowed. She was charismatic in a sharp, brittle way, and she knew how to mobilize the small contingent of equally disgruntled lifers who formed her power base. They voted her in, and she got to work. The first notice I received was for improperly stored recreational equipment. It was a garden hose, coiled on a decorative holder next to my spigot. I read the notice, read the relevant section of the HOA covenants she had cited, and saw that a garden hose on a holder was not, in fact, recreational equipment. It was a tool. I could have fought it. I could have written a letter, attended a meeting, made a case. But it was a $25 fine. It was easier to just pay it. So I did. I wrote a check, made a copy of the check and the notice, and filed them away. That was the beginning of the Carol Hartman file. On paper, it looked like an admission of guilt. In reality, it was my first piece of evidence. I was paying for the receipt. Over the next 7 years, I watched her. I didn't engage. I just observed and documented. She went after the Miller family for the color of their kids' playhouse. It was a cheerful primary blue. The HOA rules stipulated earth tones. They fought her, and she buried them in fines and legal threats until they repainted it a depressing shade of beige. She fined old Mr. Henderson, a widower in his 80s, because the service she herself had hired to paint the community mailboxes had dripped some paint on his prize-winning petunias. She claimed the petunias were planted too close to the common area structure. I saw him out there the next day, carefully digging them up, his shoulders slumped. She had a special talent for misinterpreting the governing documents in whatever way best suited her agenda. The covenants were written in the late 1970s, full of vague language and legal boilerplate. To Carol, they were scripture, and she was the sole high priestess with the authority to interpret them. A rule against temporary structures was used to forbid portable basketball hoops. A clause about maintaining a uniform appearance was twisted to mean that only 3 specific species of ornamental shrub were permitted for front yard landscaping. The issue of the back fence gate was a perfect example of her methodology. When the neighborhood was first built, the developer had put cheap 3-foot chain-link fences between the properties backing onto the green belt. My house and the 6 houses on either side of it all had one. Over the years, people had replaced them with nicer, taller wood fences. My predecessor had installed the current 6-foot cedar fence 20 years ago. He had 2 young sons, and he put a small gate in the back so they could easily get to the park. It was a kindness, a convenience. Other neighbors did the same. For 2 decades, it was never an issue. When I moved in, I rarely used the gate. I preferred the 5-minute walk around the block to the park entrance, but occasionally, if I was just taking some yard clippings to the compost pile in the woods, I'd use it. I kept it unlocked. Then, about a year ago, I started noticing things. A discarded fast food bag near my rose bushes. A dog owner letting their animal do its business in my yard without cleaning it up. Teenagers using the path as a shortcut at all hours of the night. Their voices loud and their language crude. The quiet I had purchased was being eroded, inch by inch. The final straw was finding a group of them smoking something that was definitely not tobacco on my patio furniture one evening. They had just let themselves in through the gate. I was a police captain for 30 years. I am not easily intimidated. I walked out, turned on the floodlights, and told them in no uncertain terms to leave. They scattered, but the message was clear. My property had become a public thoroughfare. My peace was gone. The next day I bought the lock. And the day after that, I got my first notice from Carol. Illegal obstruction of community path. I responded with a polite, formal email. I attached a copy of my property survey from when I bought the house. The survey is a legal document prepared by a licensed surveyor, and it shows the precise, legally recognized boundaries of a piece of land. Mine showed, unequivocally, that the fence and the gate were located a full 2 feet inside my property line. The path she was referring to was, in fact, my backyard. She did not respond to the email. Instead, a week later, I received a certified letter. It was a formal cease and desist drafted on what looked like a cheap online legal template, repeating her claims of historic use and prescriptive easement. It was nonsense, legally speaking. A prescriptive easement, the right to use someone else's land, acquired through long-term, open use, is notoriously difficult to prove. It requires the use to be adverse, meaning without the owner's permission. For 20 years, my predecessor and I had given permission by leaving the gate unlocked. Our permission nullified any claim of adverse use. She had no idea. She was so used to people folding under the weight of her official-looking letters and empty threats that she never bothered to learn the actual law. I responded to her certified letter with my own. I hired a real lawyer, a friend of a friend who specialized in property law, to draft it. It was a beautiful piece of work, concise and brutal. It explained, in simple but legally precise terms, the concept of permissive use. It cited state case law. It included a newly commissioned survey of my property, which I had ordered the day I got her letter, just to be thorough. The new survey confirmed the old one. The letter concluded by stating that any attempt on her part or on the part of the HOA to enter my property or tamper with my fence would be considered trespassing and would be dealt with accordingly. I sent it via certified mail, with signature required. The tracking information showed that it was signed for by one Carol Hartman. I printed the confirmation page and placed it in my file. Her response was silence. For 6 months, nothing. The fines stopped. The letters stopped. I knew she wasn't dropping it. Carol wasn't the type to admit defeat. She was regrouping, stewing, waiting for an opportunity. I enjoyed the peace, but I didn't relax. I used the time to prepare. I installed a high-definition security camera, the kind used in commercial businesses, discreetly under the eaves of my roof. It was aimed directly at the back gate. It recorded in 4K, had night vision, and uploaded everything to a secure cloud server. I tested it meticulously. The footage was date and time-stamped. Admissible. Then, this morning, she finally made her move. The bolt cutters were an escalation, but a predictable one. She had exhausted her paper-based tactics and was moving on to direct action. It was a critical mistake. Her performance on my patio, her threats, her claims of authority, it was all now preserved in crystal-clear, high-definition video and audio. Her call to the police was the icing on the cake. She was inviting the very system I had mastered into her little kingdom of make-believe rules. She thought she was calling in an airstrike on my position. She was actually calling it in on herself. After locking the door, I didn't just go to my desk. I went to the kitchen first and refilled my coffee. I sat down at my large oak desk, the same one I'd had in my office at the precinct. It was covered in neat stacks of paper, books, and the file. The file was a simple manila folder at first. Now it was a 3-inch thick, 3-ring binder with color-coded tabs. It had a title, printed neatly on the spine, Hartman C. HOA Matter, 2023. I flipped to the tab labeled Contingencies. I had a flowchart. It was a habit from my old job. You always game out the possibilities. Suspect flees, suspect resists, suspect confesses. I had a branch for antagonist escalates to physical action, and under that, a sub-branch, antagonist calls authorities. My finger traced the line. It led to a simple box. Initiate Protocol 7. Protocol 7 was my name for the plan I had developed. It was thorough. I opened my laptop and pulled up the security camera footage from the last 20 minutes. I trimmed the relevant clip, from her stepping onto my property to her fumbling for her phone, and saved it to a separate, clearly labeled file. I downloaded the audio track and ran it through a simple program to boost the clarity of her voice. Her threats were now unmistakable. Next, I pulled up a fresh document and began to type. It was a formal statement, a sworn declaration. I wrote it in the precise, emotionless language of a police report. At approximately 6:42 hours, on Tuesday, October 26th, the individual identified as Carol Hartman, DOB May 14, 1958, did knowingly and unlawfully enter the curtilage of my property, located at 124 Willow Lane. I detailed the events factually, referencing the video evidence. I listed the specific state statutes I believed she had violated. While I was typing, I heard the distant but unmistakable sound of a siren. It grew closer, then stopped abruptly. They were here. I looked out the front window and saw a standard patrol car, the county sheriff's department markings gleaming in the growing light. 2 deputies were getting out. One was a senior officer, a man I didn't recognize, probably a transplant from another county. The other was young, barely out of the academy, with a face full of earnest concentration. His name tag read Miller. I recognized the name. He was the son of a detective I'd mentored 20 years ago. Small world. I didn't go out to meet them. That's not how this works. You let them establish the scene. You let them talk to the complainant first. You let the other party tell their whole, entire, emotional story, digging themselves deeper with every fabrication. I watched from my window as Carol launched into her performance. Her hands waved. She pointed at my house, at the fence. Her voice, even from here, had the shrill, aggrieved tone of a victim. The senior deputy had his notepad out, nodding patiently. The younger one, Miller, stood slightly back, his eyes scanning the property, his expression unreadable but professional. He was doing his job. He was observing. Good kid. This took about 10 minutes. It was crucial time. It allowed her to commit her version of events to 2 sworn officers of the law, a version that was about to be spectacularly contradicted by reality. When the senior deputy finally detached himself from her and started walking up my driveway, I was ready. I opened the door before he knocked. "Good morning, officer," I said. "Captain Robert Miller, retired," I added, holding up my old departmental ID, not to pull rank, but to establish a baseline of credibility and to signal that I spoke his language. The deputy's eyes, tired and cynical a moment ago, flickered down to the ID, then back up to my face. A switch flipped. The patient, civilian-facing demeanor was replaced by a more direct, professional respect. "Captain," he said, nodding. "Deputy Clark, my partner is Deputy Miller." "I thought I recognized the name," I said with a small smile. "His father was a good man, a fine detective." A flicker of a smile on Clark's face. "He's a good kid. A bit green, but he'll get there." The small talk was over. "Sir, we received a call from a Miss Carol Hartman regarding a property dispute." "I'm sure you did," I said. "She alleges you've illegally blocked a public right-of-way and are refusing to cooperate." "That is the substance of her complaint, yes," I confirmed. "Would you like to come in? I just brewed a fresh pot of coffee." "I appreciate that, sir, but we should probably handle this out here for now," he said, gesturing vaguely toward Carol, who was watching us with hawk-like intensity from the sidewalk. "Could you tell me your side of the story?" "My side is quite simple," I said. "But it's better if I show you." I stepped back inside for a moment and returned with a single, clear plastic folder. Inside were 3 documents. "This is a copy of my deed," establishing ownership of the property. This is a copy of the property survey conducted by licensed surveyor John C. Riley of Northwest Surveying Associates, dated 3 months ago. And this, I said, handing him the folder, is a printout of the parcel map from the county assessor's office, which I downloaded this morning. As you can see, the property line, marked here in red, extends 2 feet beyond the fence line. Deputy Clark took the folder. He was a professional. He didn't just glance at it, he read it. He looked at the surveyor's seal. He looked at the legal description on the deed. He compared it to the assessor's map. Young Deputy Miller moved closer to look over his shoulder, his eyes wide with interest. This was turning into a field training exercise. On paper, Clark said after a long moment. This seems pretty clear-cut, Captain. This is your property. That's what the paper says, I agreed. And that's what the law says. The issue is that Ms. Hartman's feelings do not align with the legally established facts. She mentioned a prescriptive easement due to 20 years of use, Clark noted, showing he'd been paying attention to her tirade. A common misconception, I said. The use was permissive, not adverse. The gate was unlocked as a courtesy. Once that courtesy was abused, the permission was revoked. I have certified mail receipts showing that Ms. Hartman and the HOA board were formally notified of this in a letter drafted by my attorney 6 months ago. I didn't have those documents with me. You never show your whole hand at once. You provide just enough to resolve the immediate situation. Clark nodded. A slow, deep nod of understanding. He had seen this movie before, just as I had. The citizen with a binder always beats the citizen with a grievance. He handed the folder back to me. Well, sir, this is a civil matter. It's a dispute between you and your HOA. There's no criminal action for us to take here. Ordinarily, I would agree with you, Deputy, I said, my voice hardening slightly. However, this morning, it did become a criminal matter. I turned and pointed to the bolt cutters, still lying on my patio. At 6:42 a.m., Ms. Hartman was on my property, without my permission, attempting to destroy my private property. I have it on video. She then issued a direct threat to me, which also constitutes a criminal offense. I would like to file a formal police report for criminal trespass and attempted criminal mischief. And I would like to have those bolt cutters taken into evidence. A profound silence fell over the driveway. Deputy Clark looked from me to the bolt cutters and then over to Carol, who was starting to look less triumphant and more confused. The script she had in her head was not playing out. Her hired muscle had not arrived to enforce her will. Instead, they were having a calm, technical conversation with her adversary. Young Deputy Miller was the first to speak. "Criminal mischief, sir?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of academic curiosity. "Attempted," I corrected gently. She didn't succeed in damaging the lock, but the intent was clear, and her presence on the property after being given formal notice not to enter is textbook trespass. Clark sighed. It was the sigh of a man whose simple traffic and noise complaint morning had just become a mountain of paperwork. "All right, Captain," he said. He turned to Miller. "Miller, go talk to Ms. Hartman. Get her side of the story about this morning. And for God's sake, be professional. I'll get the statement from the captain." He looked at me. "Sir, I am going to need to see that video." "Of course," I said. "I've already isolated the clip for you. I can email it to you directly from my desk. Would you like to come in now?" This time, he didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir, I think I would." As Deputy Clark followed me inside, I glanced back over my shoulder. Deputy Miller was approaching Carol. Her arms were crossed, her foot was tapping, and her face was a thundercloud. He was speaking to her in the calm, placating tones that all cops learn. I saw her mouth open, and even from this distance I could feel the vitriol. But Miller just stood there, notepad in hand, letting her storm break against his professional calm. He was going to be a good cop. The next hour was a masterclass in procedural bureaucracy, and I enjoyed every second of it. I sat Deputy Clark at my kitchen table, gave him a cup of coffee. He took it with cream and 2 sugars, and a legal pad. I airdropped the video file to his department-issued smartphone. He watched it twice, his face impassive. Then I dictated my sworn statement. I used the language I had prepared, citing the statutes, the times, the facts. No emotion, no hyperbole, just the cold, hard architecture of the event. While he was writing, Deputy Miller came to the door. He looked exhausted. "Sir, Ms. Hartman's statement is different from yours," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I imagine it is," I said. "She claims the bolt cutters are not hers. She says she found them on the path and was merely attempting to remove them as a safety hazard," Miller reported, his face a perfect mask of neutrality. Clark looked up from his notepad. "Did you ask her why she was trying to remove a safety hazard by using it to cut a lock?" "I did, sir," Miller said. "She said she was confused and panicked because the captain here," he nodded at me, "was yelling at her." I hadn't raised my voice once. The video proved it. Clark and I exchanged a look. It was a look that spanned 30 years of shared experience dealing with the public. It said, "Some people will lie, even when they know you know they're lying." "Did you retrieve the bolt cutters, Deputy?" Clark asked. "Yes, sir. Bagged and tagged as evidence," Miller confirmed. "I'll run the serial number, but they look brand new, probably from the hardware store down the road." "Good work," Clark said. He finished his report, signed the bottom, and had me sign my statement. "Okay, Captain, here's what's going to happen. We're filing a report. It will be referred to the prosecutor's office. Given the clarity of the evidence, I suspect Ms. Hartman will be hearing from them. It's their decision whether to press charges for the trespass and mischief. The coercion charge is trickier, but it's in the report. That's all I ask," I said, "that it be documented." "It's documented," he assured me. "As for the civil matter, the fence, this report will be part of the public record. Your attorney will be able to access it. I have a feeling it will be very helpful in any future interactions with the HOA." He stood up, and Miller and I stood with him. "Sir," he said, offering his hand, "it was an honor to meet you, and I'm sorry you had to deal with this on a Tuesday morning." "I've had worse Tuesdays, Deputy," I said, shaking his hand. "Thank you for your professionalism." I walked them to the door. Carol was gone. Her car, a pristine white Lexus SUV, was no longer parked at the curb. The stage was empty. The show was over. The deputies got in their car and drove away. I was left with a copy of the case number Clark had given me, a full cup of now cold coffee, and a profound sense of quiet satisfaction. This was the turning point. She had brought the real world, with its real rules and real consequences, into her fantasy kingdom, and the real world was about to dismantle it, piece by piece. The police report was just the beginning. It was a foundational document, a cornerstone upon which the rest of my case would be built. But it wasn't the weapon itself. The real weapon was still sitting in the 3-ring binder on my desk. Now, it was time to load it. The day after the incident with the deputies, the neighborhood was strangely quiet. I imagined Carol was laying low, either licking her wounds or plotting her next move. My money was on the latter. People like her don't learn from their mistakes. They just learn to resent the people who expose them. The silence was an opportunity. The first thing I did was make a phone call. Not to my lawyer, but to a man named Arthur Pence. Arthur was my corroborating professional. For 40 years he had been the chief records clerk for the county planning department. He'd retired 2 years before I did, but his knowledge of the county's labyrinthine archives of deeds, plats, easements, and zoning variances was legendary. He was the human search engine for every piece of property in 1,000 square miles. We'd worked together on dozens of cases over the years, usually complex fraud or land use schemes. "Robert," his gravelly voice answered on the second ring. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Don't tell me you finally decided to illegally subdivide your lot and build a casino." "Not today, Arthur," I chuckled. "Today I'm just a humble retiree being harassed by his HOA president." "I have a small research project for you," I explained the situation. The fence, the historic use claim, the specific parcel numbers involved. Arthur listened patiently, making little grunting noises of interest. Hartman, he mused when I was done. Carol Hartman, that name rings a bell, let me guess. Short woman, looks like she could curdle milk with a dirty look? That's the one, I said. Yeah, I remember her. She came in here a few years back, trying to get the county to declare the Miller's tree a public nuisance, because it was dropping leaves on her precious lawn. We told her to pound sand. She doesn't like being told no, that one. He paused. So you just want me to pull the plat map and the chain of title for your lot? I want everything, Arthur, I said. I want the original developer's plans from 1978. I want every permit, every variance, every easement recorded for this entire block. I want to know who owned the Greenbelt land before it was a Greenbelt. I want to know if the HOA has ever, in its entire history, formally recorded any easement or right-of-way over any of these properties. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of him lighting one of his smelly little cigars. Bobby, he said, using my old precinct nickname. What did this woman do to you? She tried to cut my fence with bolt cutters, I said simply. Arthur let out a low whistle. Okay then. Consider it done. This sounds like fun. I'll have to go down to the archives in person. Some of that old stuff isn't digitized. Give me 2 days. With Arthur on the case, I turned my attention to another front. The community. I knew I wasn't Carol's only victim. I had seen her reign of petty terror for years. But fear is a powerful insulator. Everyone was afraid of being her next target, so they kept their heads down. My open defiance and the very public visit from the sheriff's department had created a crack in that fear. That evening my doorbell rang. It was Mr. Henderson, the old widower whose petunias had been a casualty of Carol's mailbox painting project. He was a frail man, with thin, papery skin, and eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of gentle sorrow. He was holding a foil-covered plate. "Robert," he said, his voice a soft, hesitant whisper. "My daughter made a lemon meringue pie. It's too much for just me. I thought you might. I saw the police earlier. I hope everything is all right." "Everything is fine, George," I said, taking the pie. "Thank you. This is very kind. Why don't you come in?" He hesitated, glancing nervously up and down the street as if expecting Carol to leap out of the bushes. "I don't want to be a bother." "You're not a bother. Come in," I insisted. I sat him down at the kitchen table, cut him a large slice of his own pie, and poured him a cup of decaf. For a while we just sat in silence. Then he finally looked at me, his eyes watery. "She's a bully, that one," he said quietly. "A real bully. What she did to my flowers. My Mary. She loved those petunias. I planted them for her, you know. After she passed." "I know, George," I said gently. "I never said anything," he continued, looking down at his hands. "I was afraid. She threatened me with fines. Said she'd have the board force me to resod my whole lawn. I'm on a fixed income, Robert. I can't afford that." He looked up, and there was a flicker of something new in his eyes. A spark of anger. "But what she's doing to you, that's different. That's just wrong. That fence has been there forever. That gate is your gate. Mr. Henderson was my fearful ally. He was the conscience of the community. He just needed to know he wasn't alone." "George," I said, leaning forward. "Did you ever talk to her about the petunias? On the phone, maybe?" He looked confused. "Well, yes. I called her to ask why the painters had been so careless. She was not very nice." "Do you happen to have a record of that call, George?" I asked. "Some phone companies keep logs." He shook his head. "No, but—" "Wait." A light went on in his eyes. "My daughter, she set up my phone for me. She said it was for my safety. It records all my calls. In case I fall, you know. So I can tell the paramedics what happened." My heart beat a little faster. "George, would you be willing to see if you have a recording of that conversation with Mrs. Hartman?" An hour later, he was back, holding his smartphone like it was a holy relic. He had the file. We listened to it together. It was horrifying. Carol, in her full, unrestrained glory, berating an 80-year-old man, threatening him, belittling him for his ugly flowers and his whining. It was pure, unadulterated malice. "I'll need a copy of this, George," I said, my voice grim. "This is important evidence." "You can have it," he said, his voice firm. "You can have anything you need. It's time someone stood up to her." The next day Arthur called. His voice was electric with the thrill of discovery. "Bobby, you're not going to believe this. I'm in the basement of the county courthouse, and I'm holding a document from 1983. It's a quitclaim deed. A quitclaim deed is a legal instrument used to transfer interest in real property. Unlike a warranty deed, it doesn't guarantee that the seller holds clear title. It just transfers whatever interest the seller does have. They're often used to clear up title ambiguities. "What about it?" I asked. "It's between the original developer, West Pro Homes, and the Northwood Creek Homeowners Association, Phase 1, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. West Pro went bankrupt in '82, and the county was trying to clean up their assets. The HOA was formally incorporated in '81. According to this, West Pro transferred ownership of several common area parcels to the HOA. The playground, the little patch of land at the entrance with the sign, a few other bits. But here's the kicker." I waited, my pen hovering over a fresh legal pad. "The green belt," he said, "was never transferred. West Pro had a deal with the county to leave it undeveloped in exchange for higher density zoning on the lots themselves, but they never formally deeded it to the county or the HOA. As far as the law is concerned, that strip of land behind your house is still technically owned by a defunct corporation that hasn't existed for 40 years. This was the bombshell. This was the community property that Carol lorded over, the source of her power, and the basis for her crusade against my fence. Didn't even belong to the HOA. They had no legal standing to make any rules about it whatsoever. They were, in effect, squatters. "Are you sure, Arthur?" I breathed. "As sure as the ink on this paper," he said. "The HOA has been paying a landscaping company to mow a strip of land they have absolutely no legal right to. They've been acting as landlords for a property they don't own. Any rule they've made concerning that greenbelt is completely unenforceable." I hung up the phone, my mind racing. This changed everything. My fight was no longer about just defending my own property line. I had just discovered the foundational lie upon which Carol Hartman's entire regime was built. But there was more. The day before the annual HOA meeting, which had been scheduled for months, Carol made her final, desperate move. Perhaps she sensed the tide turning against her. Perhaps the prosecutor's office had contacted her. Whatever the reason, she overplayed her hand spectacularly. Every homeowner in Northwood Creek received a thick envelope via first-class mail. Inside was a newsletter, printed on glossy paper with the HOA logo at the top. The lead story was titled, "Protecting Our Community Assets." It was a thinly veiled, libelous attack on me. It didn't use my name, but referred to a certain resident on Willow Lane who was attempting to illegally seize community property for his own selfish use. It talked about my aggressive behavior and refusal to cooperate with the board. It painted me as a wealthy, entitled outsider, trying to destroy the neighborhood's character. And then came the final escalation. Tucked inside the newsletter was a formal notice of a special assessment. The board, which meant Carol, had voted to levy a $5,000 fee on every single homeowner. The purpose? To fund a legal defense fund to sue me and reclaim the community pathway. She was trying to get the entire neighborhood to pay for her personal vendetta against me. It was a declaration of war, but she had made a fatal error. She had put her lies, her exaggerations, and her illegal assessment in writing, and mailed it to every potential juror. The newsletter was not an act of strength. It was a confession. I carefully placed my copy in the binder. It was Exhibit D. My phone started ringing. It was the Miller family. It was the people who had been forced to repaint their playhouse. It was a woman I barely knew from the next street over, who had been fined for having a political sign on her lawn 2 days after the election. It was Susan, a quiet accountant who had been on the HOA board for a year and was sick of being Carol's rubber stamp. She was my disillusioned insider. She didn't even call a proper meeting, Robert, Susan told me, her voice shaking with anger. She just sent an email to the board members saying we needed to approve the assessment, and that if we didn't, we would be personally liable when you sued the HOA. Two of the older members were scared and just agreed. It wasn't a real vote. It's not valid. Will you testify to that, Susan? I asked. There was a pause. Yes, she said, her voice firming. Yes, I will. The coalition was forming. The annual meeting was in 24 hours. It was time to go over my presentation one last time. The Northwood Creek Community Clubhouse was a modest building, smelling faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. On the night of the annual HOA meeting, it was packed to the gills. Every one of the 150 folding chairs was filled, and people were standing 3 deep along the back wall. These meetings were usually a dreary affair, attended by a dozen or so of the usual suspects. Tonight, thanks to Carol's newsletter, it was the hottest ticket in town. The air was thick with tension and cheap perfume. I arrived early, along with my lawyer, a sharp woman named Ms. Albright, whom my property law friend had recommended. She specialized in HOA litigation and had a reputation as a shark. I had walked her through the binder, and her eyes had lit up with a predatory glee. I was no longer just a client. I was her passion project. With us was Mr. Henderson, looking terrified but resolute, and Susan, the board member, who sat near the front, her face pale. Carol and the 2 other board members, a pair of nervous-looking men in their late 60s, sat at a long table at the front of the room. Carol was in her element. She wore a power suit. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, and she surveyed the packed room with a triumphant smile, mistaking the crowd's anger for a show of support for her cause. She was the star of her own movie, and this was her big scene. The meeting began with the usual, tedious formalities. Approval of the previous year's minutes, a treasurer's report that was suspiciously vague. Then, Carol stood up to give the president's address. This was her performance. She started with a trembling voice, a practiced performance of a reluctant leader, forced into a difficult position. My dear neighbors, she began, it is with a heavy heart that I stand before you tonight. Our community, our peaceful, beautiful home is under attack. She launched into her narrative. It was the same one from the newsletter, but embellished with dramatic pauses and crocodile tears. She spoke of the sacred trust of the community's common areas, the 20 years of tradition of the pathway, and the selfish actions of one individual who sought to tear it all down. She never used my name, but she kept glancing in my direction, casting me as the villain in her melodrama. This resident, she said, her voice thick with fake emotion, has refused all attempts at reasonable compromise. He has responded to our neighborly requests with aggression and threats. He even called the police on me, your president, for simply trying to uphold the rules that we all agreed to live by. A murmur went through the crowd. Some of her supporters nodded in sympathy. Others, like the Millers, just glared. And so, she concluded, moving in for the kill, the board was left with no choice. We have had to retain legal counsel to defend our community's property. And we have had to issue a special assessment to cover the costs of this legal battle. I know it is a burden. It breaks my heart to ask it of you, but what is the alternative? To let one person bully us into surrendering our shared assets? To let him steal what belongs to all of us? She sat down to a smattering of applause from her core supporters. She looked smug, confident. She had framed the debate. Gaha. It was her, the defender of the community, against me, the selfish outsider. She had no idea. The next item on the agenda was new business and open forum. Miss Albright stood up. Madam President, she said, her voice clear and carrying easily through the room, Robert Miller, the resident of 124 Willow Lane, has requested time to address the community. He has prepared a short presentation. Carol's eyes narrowed. This was not in her script. This is highly irregular, she began. The bylaws allow for any member in good standing to address the assembly during the open forum. Ms. Albright countered smoothly, holding up a copy of the very bylaws Carol claimed to cherish. My client is a member in good standing, or is it your position that he is not? Checkmate. Trapped by her own rules. Carol sputtered for a moment, then waved a dismissive hand. Fine, but he must keep it brief. We have other business. I didn't stand up. Miss Albright did. She walked to the front of the room and placed a projector on a small table, which I had brought in earlier. She plugged it into her laptop. This will only take a few minutes, she said. The screen flickered to life, illuminating the wall behind Carol's head. As Ms. Hartman has correctly stated, Ms. Albright began, this dispute centers on a piece of property. The law is very clear about property. It is defined by documents. So, let's look at some. The first image on the screen was a high-resolution scan of my property survey. A bright red line clearly showed the fence 2 feet inside my property. Exhibit A, Ms. Albright said, a certified survey from a licensed professional. It shows the fence and the gate are entirely on Mr. Miller's private property. The second image was the county assessor's map, with the same red line. Exhibit B, the official county record, confirming the survey. Carol shifted in her seat. Historic use establishes an easement, she called out. An excellent point, Madam President, Ms. Albright said, without missing a beat. Let's talk about that. The next slide was a scan of the certified mail receipt Carol had signed 6 months ago. Exhibit C, acknowledgement of receipt of a letter, drafted by counsel, explaining that the prior use of the gate was permissive and that this permission was now revoked. By continuing to claim a right-of-way, after this date, the HOA was knowingly trespassing. The murmur in the room grew louder. People were turning to look at Carol, whose smile was beginning to look a little brittle. But perhaps, Ms. Albright continued, the HOA had some other claim to the land. We decided to investigate. The next image was the bombshell. It was the quitclaim deed from 1983 that Arthur had found. Exhibit D, a quitclaim deed from the county archives. It shows the parcels of land that were transferred from the developer to the HOA, as you can see from the highlighted list. The green belt is not on it. A collective gasp went through the room. To put it in simple terms, Ms. Albright explained, the Northwood Creek HOA has never at any point in its history owned the green belt. It has no more legal authority over that land than I do. For 40 years, the HOA has been operating under a false assumption. Every rule, every fine, every threat related to the green belt has been completely and utterly without legal basis. The room was silent. You could hear a pin drop. All eyes were on Carol. The color had drained from her face. The performative tyrant's mask was not just slipping, it was shattering. She looked small and lost and utterly, totally exposed. This was the moment, the collapse. She stared at the document on the screen, her mouth slightly agape, as if she could not comprehend what she was seeing. But Ms. Albright wasn't finished. This brings us to the events of last Tuesday, she said, her voice turning icy. The screen changed. It was the video from my security camera. The room watched in stunned silence as Carol Hartman, in her pink velour tracksuit, fumbled with the bolt cutters. We heard my calm voice and her shrill, threatening response. We heard her declare her intention to fine me and place a lien on my house. We heard her say, I am the authority here. Then, the next slide. A scan of the police report with the case number clearly visible. Exhibit E, the official police report documenting criminal trespass and attempted criminal mischief by Ms. Hartman. The matter has been referred to the county prosecutor. The final slide was a scan of the newsletter and the special assessment notice. And Exhibit F, Ms. Albright said, her voice dripping with contempt. A fraudulent special assessment, levied without a proper board vote. Here she nodded toward Susan, who nodded back firmly. To fund a personal vendetta using the community's money. This, ladies and gentlemen, is likely mail fraud. Miss Albright turned off the projector. The lights came up. The silence was deafening. She walked back to her seat, her work done. I stood up. I hadn't planned to speak, but I felt I had to. I looked directly at Carol. The fence stays locked, I said. my voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. The special assessment is illegal and will not be paid. I expect a full, public retraction of the libelous statements made in the newsletter and a formal apology to be sent to every homeowner at the HOA's expense. My lawyer will be in touch regarding the refund of all illegal fines levied by this board against residents concerning the Greenbelt, and I will be filing a civil suit against you personally, Carol, for damages. Then I turned to the rest of the room. I just wanted to be left alone, I said. That's all. I just wanted some peace and quiet. And then I sat down. The dam of silence broke. It wasn't a debate. It was a revolution. The Millers stood up and demanded a refund for their playhouse paint. Mr. Henderson, his voice surprisingly strong, told the story of his petunias and Carol's abusive phone call. Susan stood and formally accused Carol of violating the bylaws and falsifying a board vote. One of the two men on the board with Carol, seeing which way the wind was blowing, immediately announced his resignation, effective immediately. The other just stared at his hands. Carol sat there, frozen, as her little empire crumbled around her. Her supporters were silent, looking at the floor, at the ceiling, anywhere but at her. She had no documents, no facts, no defense. Her only weapon had been performance and intimidation, and in the bright, unforgiving light of documented reality, it had turned to dust. A motion was made from the floor to recall Carol Hartman as president. It was seconded by a dozen voices. A vote was called. It was nearly unanimous. She was out, stripped of her title and her power in the space of 15 minutes. She didn't say a word. She just stood up, a strange blank look on her face, gathered her purse and walked out of the clubhouse. No one watched her go. Everyone was too busy talking, laughing, and shaking my hand. The aftermath was swift and comprehensive. The verdict, delivered in the court of public opinion that night, was ratified by legal and procedural action in the weeks that followed. A new board was elected, with Susan as the interim president. Her first act was to formally rescind the illegal special assessment. Her second was to pass a resolution, on the advice of Ms. Albright, to issue a full refund for every fine Carol had ever issued related to the Greenbelt, landscaping, or any other rule deemed to have been based on her creative interpretation of the bylaws. It turned out to be a significant sum. An audit of the HOA's finances, conducted by Susan herself, revealed that Carol had been using the HOA's law firm for personal matters, another detail that was added to the growing file being compiled by the county prosecutor. Carol Hartman was charged with misdemeanor criminal trespass and mischief. Faced with the video evidence, she pled no contest, paid a fine, and was sentenced to community service. The irony of her having to pick up trash along the highway in her expensive athleisure wear was not lost on the community. The mail fraud investigation was dropped, but the threat of it hung over her. The civil suit I had filed was settled out of court. Her lawyer saw the mountain of evidence against her and advised her to write a check. It wasn't about the money for me. It was about the principle. The settlement included a non-disparagement clause and a legally binding agreement that she would never set foot on my property again. I donated the entire settlement amount to the local park district to fund the planting of a new grove of trees along the Greenbelt. The community began to heal. The Millers' kids got a new playhouse, painted a defiant, joyful shade of royal blue. Mr. Henderson replanted his petunias, and this time, a half-dozen neighbors came over to help, turning his small front yard into a riot of color. The oppressive beige that had settled over the neighborhood began to recede, replaced by the vibrant hues of people who were no longer afraid. The fear was gone. The letters and fines stopped. People started talking to each other again, not in whispers about the latest HOA outrage, but in normal, friendly tones. We had a neighborhood barbecue. I brought a potato salad. It felt good. Carol and her husband put their house on the market 3 months later. It sold quickly. I saw the moving truck one Saturday morning. I was on my patio, drinking my coffee, enjoying the quiet. I watched as they loaded the last of her boxes. She never looked in my direction. She got into the passenger seat of her Lexus, a woman I no longer recognized, stripped of her self-appointed authority, and was driven away, a ghost, exorcised from the neighborhood she had haunted for so long. A few weeks after she left, a small package arrived in my mail. It was from Arthur Pence. Inside was a small, brass plaque, the kind you'd put on a trophy. There was no note. The plaque was engraved with a set of numbers. They were the precise GPS coordinates for the corner post of my fence, the one her bolt cutters had scratched. The point that marked the undeniable legal boundary between my property and the world. I thought about what to do with it. Frame it? Put it on my desk. In the end, I knew where it belonged. I got my drill, a tube of epoxy, and 2 small brass screws. I walked out to the back fence, to the gate that was now, and would forever be, locked. I carefully affixed the plaque to the top of the main gate post, right over the faint scratches left by the bolt cutters. It's still there. Most people would never notice it. It's small, discreet, but I see it every morning when I have my coffee. It's not a trophy. It's not a symbol of victory. It's a reminder. A reminder that peace isn't a passive state. Sometimes it must be actively defended. It's a reminder that rules and laws are not just suggestions. They are the invisible fences that allow us to live together in a civil society. They are the bedrock of order, the bulwark against the chaos of petty tyrants and the slow creep of entitlement. My life is quiet again. The garden is thriving. The birds are back. I read my history books and drink my coffee. The gate remains locked. Not out of spite, but out of principle. It is a tangible symbol of a simple, hard-won truth. A good fence, built on a firm foundation of well-documented facts, makes for very quiet neighbors. And my name, for the record, is Robert Miller. Not Robert. Captain Miller, retired. And on paper that makes all the difference in the world.